Good morning and welcome to the third instalment of the Telepost Game of the Week. This week, with our huge advances in production values, we're covering the game between Mark Nightall with the white pieces and Richard Archer with the black pieces. This was the final round game in the Telepost internal Winter Swiss. And it's sort of for all the marbles. If Rich wins, he secures sole first in the Winter Swiss. If he draws, he secures at least joint first. And if Mark wins, Mark could potentially secure joint first, depending on the results of some of the other games that have yet to be played. So, Mark with the white pieces is a bit of an adventurous spirit, and the game starts with Sicilian and 2a3. Mark's apparently unaffected by 3 centuries of opening theory, and plays a lot of stuff that's quite offbeat, potentially quite dangerous. So Rich continues with g6. And after 3h4, this is very surprising, quite difficult to prepare for. It's kind of analogous to some positions in the modern or the Pert's defense, where white just immediately attacks the sort of fianchettoed bishop position with h4, h5, h6 as early as move 3. Rich prevents this directly with 3h5. So this sort of loosens up the black king side, but does prevent white's threat of advancing the pawn further. Now just continuing with their development, knight c3, knight c6, bishop c4. Perhaps exploiting the fact that in the Sicilian you normally answer this with e6. But here, doing that would leave a plethora of dark squared weaknesses. And black would have to be very careful to keep control over those. So here, bishop g7, d3. d6 and bishop g5, which on move 7 is a novelty according to the database I was using when preparing. So here, just knight f6, and the position is relatively even. Both sides, neither side is at a big disadvantage in terms of space. Black's pieces are maybe a little better placed, but there's nothing wrong with white's position. So the game continues, queen d2 and a6. So this is another way to exploit the bishop coming to c4 by playing a6. Not only do you stop any of the white pieces coming to b5 on the queen side, but you also potentially prepare to play b5 yourself, winning a tempo on the bishop and relegating it to a slightly awkward diagonal now that often in, say, the Roy Lopez or something, if the bishop retreats, it goes to b3 and then c3 gets played and the bishop can come to c2 and return into the game that way. Obviously, the a2, g8 diagonal isn't an awful place for the bishop, but it can potentially get shut out of the game in the future. So here, after a6, knight ge2. So potentially with knight ge2, you're allowing white to play f4, and attempt to launch an attack against the black king. Otherwise, f3 is normally the most active square for this knight, and by playing this, you do need to be aware of how the possibilities for the knight change, the potential pawn advances. So after knight g2, b5 comes as expected, and bishop a2. And now, just after bishop b7, again, continuing to develop. So you can see that even in quite an unexpected opening situation, Black is just putting his pieces, bring his pieces out, he's putting them on good squares, and at this point I think Black is already set up quite nicely for the game. So White continues with rook b1, which is often played in these dragon type structures where the bishop's on g7, just to essentially move the rook off its tender diagonal, make sure it's not a tactical liability in the future. With the pawns already so far advanced on the queen side, I don't think that castling queenside for White is a very attractive prospect anymore. And consequently, this may just also allow White to consider b4 in some situations in the future, obviously not immediately. So after rook b1, rook c8, again just bring the rook to an active square, potentially supporting a pawn advance here, which if the pawns were to get exchanged in the future, this bishop on a2 could be left completely out of the game. So, for example, that exchange happens, we could see a situation where White's bishop is just useless. Now, here I think Black is already doing reasonably well, but after this next move, I think that's definitely secured. So, Mark continued with knight f4, which here's some interesting sort of justification for. It does prevent you from playing f4 and potentially f5 or e5 to break open the centre. So that is one thing to be aware of. But the other problem with this move is that it takes away any retreat path for this bishop on g5. So after Rich responds accurately with knight h7, this bishop can no longer retreat, and potentially Black can win the bishop pair immediately. There is an interesting little tactic here. So if White makes some sort of non-committal move, like castling for instance, then Black might be tempted to trap the bishop with f6, at which point knight takes g6, traps the rook in the corner, and potentially wins the exchange. So just for example, you can't take here because takes, and the white knight is already out of play. The black king is very, very weak here. So here, while the material is okay for black, the position is not. So that's just an interesting little point. But Mark had a much more radical idea here, where he just played bishop e6, which is a very striking sacrifice. And this is really a moment where I think this isn't so much a sort of tactics exercise per se, but a good calculation moment. If you do fancy practicing your calculation, just pause the video for a minute or two and try to work out what the strongest response would be to this move. Okay, so I assume everyone who paused will have seen the first couple of moves of this idea. When I was watching the game, I thought potentially Rook b8 was just a strong reply, where you just, or even Rook c7 might be an option. Just saying, well, you know, your bishop isn't actually making a threat on e6. I can ignore that sacrifice, and then your pieces are still somewhat tangled, and the bishop is on a silly square. However, Rich held his nerve and simply took the piece. Now, I assume everyone's seen that the next obvious step is for white to take the pawn on e6 with a fork on the queen and on the bishop on g7 with check. So the only move, obviously, is to, or the sensible move is to put the queen on d7, which Richard did. Now takes g7 check. Now king to f7. And here you suddenly notice this knight is trapped. So while the black king has been opened up a little bit, white no longer just regains his piece. Mark continued with bishop h6 just to defend the knight. Alright, so after this, I was just looking at the simple move bishop to, not bishop to g8, sorry, rook cg8. And if black exchanges the rook for two pieces, in this position it's very hard to say that the rook is white having the rook and pawn will be able to compete with the two pieces, just because the position is so closed. It's very difficult for, and in a sort of closed position in a middle game, the two pieces are usually stronger than the rook and pawn. So I was looking at this. Richard instead continued with knight f6, just to presumably cover the king from checks, and again just a useful move to make as well, bringing the knight back into the game. So after knight d5 here, again, Rich continued with rook cg8, rook h3. Here I was still looking at this position, where black, again, is much better with the two pieces than the rook and pawn. But after rook h3, Rich decided to continue a bit more actively, moving his queen to g4, so threatening this pawn on g2. And again, as you'll see, for the last several moves, white has continued to be in this position where his bishop can't move because it's needed to defend the knight. His knight can't move because it's got no escape squares. And so black can take those pieces at his leisure. He isn't obligated to take them immediately. Now after queen g5, which offers an exchange of queens, which would play out something like queen g5, hg5, knight d5, ed5, knight e5, where, I don't know, I think black remains better even if the knight can escape. With a move like, with a sequence like this. So even if the knight can escape, the bishop is not fulfilling an enormously useful role over on h6. And once black marshals his pieces together, black should be doing very well indeed. But instead of this exchange, Rich decided to go for knight d4, playing actively and making a threat. And Mark overlooked it, and that was the end of the game, with queen e2 checkmate. So this is a game that really exemplifies the style for two players. Mark going for these adventurous openings and sort of quite difficult to judge positions, and Rich being very solid, tactically alert, and calculating through. Again, it kind of shows that a lot of times with these sacrifices, if you calculate the whole line through, you can come out of the other side with great position. This leaves Richard as the deserved winner of the Telepost Winter Swiss, and I'm sure we're all looking forward to the next internal club tournament, which will be a round robin, I think. Anyway, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.